Hello and welcome. Welcome to the SCTE webinar series. Let me just get rid of some of that. Firstly, a thank you to Melissa for getting this webinar series put together. Anybody thinking about having a webinar, please contact Melissa at the scte.eu. The second thank you is to all the attendees. There's 186 registered and we already have 49 on. Really well done. Thank you. The last thank you for now is to CommScope for giving us all the opportunity to hear about 10G access developments, near-term architecture, and future evolution. Our guide through this will be James Harwood, an SCTE fellow and executive member. James, it's all yours.
Cool. Cheers for the intro, Tony. So first of all, welcome back for any of you that have kind of attended one of these webinars before. You probably start to get a feel for the kind of how it will flow. For those for the first time here, welcome. And just to kind of kick things off, I'm just going to chat through the kind of structure, the kind of process for today. So I've got the lovely pleasure of moderator, and what I'll be doing is kind of fielding your questions into our kind of experts that you're going to hear from CommScope. We're aiming for around 60 minutes for the webinar. And we're going to hear through from kind of two speakers in that time. Each has a kind of short presentation I'll be running through. The key part of these webinars, however, is to field your questions to them and kind of give you the opportunity to ask what you need to hear or want to hear. To do that, we're going to be using obviously Zoom's functionality. Two features within Zoom, or ways you can ask your questions, will be the Q&A function first of all, and we'll be keeping a close eye on that. Or if not, we've just got the chat function as well. If you are going to ask your question via chat, just make sure you direct it towards the panelists option. And that just means it lands with us. And what we'll do is we'll make sure we try and get that asked throughout the webinar. As brave as they are, both speakers have kind of agreed for me to throw your questions at them as we go through the presentation. So what I'll be doing is finding a slight pause in each, and as your questions kind of come through where the topics are relevant, I'll try and get them asked kind of straight away for you. We will be holding back a few questions kind of to the end, depending on how the flow is. But by all means, ask away as you go through, so don't hold them back to the end. Ask them when they're kind of pertinent and the topic's been raised, and we'll try and get them asked kind of straight away for you. So we're joined by two speakers from CommScope. I'm going to do some introductions first of all with Dave as our first speaker, and then kind of midway through I'll be handed back, and then I'll use that opportunity to introduce you, Owen, while he gets his screen set up and slides on screen. Another cool thing, we're conscious we saw this kind of presentation throughout. As we all like a good old acronym or an initialism, it's full of them. And actually, rather than see these questions come through, CommScope's pulled together a great jargon buster. What we'll be doing is shortly posting that in the chat just as we start through these presentations. So by all means, refer to that. There's a few acronyms in this list that I haven't used in day-to-day language yet. So by all means, hopefully that's useful for you as we go through this presentation. So I'm going to stop talking shortly, but before I do that, I'm just going to introduce our first speaker. So David Keane Birajka. Bear with me, I haven't committed your full intro to memory, so I am just going to read this one through quickly, and then I will hand in to you. So David's been in the service provider business since the late 1980s. A UK national by birth, educated in England, he began his career at British Telecom in the electromechanical era of telephone exchange switching. A short tenure at Cable and Wireless was followed by his first senior role at what has become Virgin Media. A national cable operator where his notable achievements included the rollout of the first national UK IP ATM network and cable broadband infrastructure in the late 90s. This was followed by other notable achievements in the service provider cable space with the analog to digital transition, the forerunner to the interactive digital TV we enjoy today. A couple more bits. He's been busy since then. So from working in the service provider space, he then moved into supporting SPs. David enhanced his career with a move to Cisco Systems in '99, supporting the cable MSO industry in the EMEA area, benefiting from the experience gained previously. 2013, David moved away from Cisco to an East Coast US startup as a distinguished consultant engineer, where he gained valuable experience helping to position CASA systems as the new entrant to an already established CCAP CMTS marketplace. Rejoining Cisco in 2013, again in various technical business and market management roles, further enhanced his career with a move to the then named Aris Corporation, which we know of as today as CommScope. In 2018, where his experience complement CommScope's support in helping MSOs transition to cloud-native networks, architectures, and solutions. I'm going to pause there now. So I'm going to hand you over at this point, and we're going to hear from Dave. Like I said, get your questions into the Q&A in the chat as you start to go through. And Dave, I'll come back to you with questions as they come through.
Thanks very much indeed, James. Let me just... So I trust I'm all set up in terms of presentation, and you can see my first slide. I'd like to just say thanks very much for the opportunity just to present. It is going to be a little bit of a drag race from a starting stop in terms to a quarter mile, 200 mile an hour kind of a vision. So we've got 20 minutes to cover off quite a wide variety of discussion topics. Normally that would be set out for a good few hours, if not days. So it is going to be a bit of a drag race. So I'm going to start slow, but then it will ramp up, and feel free to ask any questions or interrupt me. I like the interactive kind of format. So please, and thanks very much. Where are we? Let's have a look at, version 1 of year 2021. It's been a bit of a whirlwind kind of 2020. Obviously, the biggest geopolitical event was around the pandemic, and that had put some severe pressures on networks. In as much that, we didn't break the internet. We gave it a damn good try. In terms of our consumption and our usage and the patterns that changed in terms of how we were relying on it. I mean, it became the most it became a utility that we just could not do without. It keeps growing. There's no doubt about it. In 2020 alone, Netflix added 37 million subscribers worldwide. Given the rate of consumption per household, that's an amazing and an incredible amount of consumption that is being driven out of the access and into the core. And we, as in the industry, both on the service provider and the vendor space, are challenged with, how do we make that more cost effective? How do we automate it? And how do we help our service providers drive revenue from the monetization of increased bandwidth usage? Not all challenges that are well known and documented elsewhere. We experienced some new environments. The home working became the new different, not the new normal. I mean, for some of us in the industry, it's been a relatively useful tool in terms of balancing that. But we all started driving more applications. Again, this all translated to more impact on bandwidth and on the SP environment. And we all became capacity planners in 2020, not only from a vendor space, not only from an SP space, but also how allocation of bandwidth in the home was used. If you had an extended family, you soon exhausted some of the lower tiers of bandwidth that was that's being delivered. So yeah, maybe version 1 of 2021 will stay as it is. I hope we don't see a version 2 or anything like that, unless it's for the better. But what will the new normal look like in the telco and SP space in terms of architectures? Obviously, I called out to facilitate bandwidth requirements and the surges to make sure that we compensate and we adequately provide a capacity to meet spikes and troughs, but also how do we automate some of that? And there's some key kind of thought process around, well, a typical CTIO will not want to have to close down his network because of another geopolitical event like a pandemic. So maybe automation and network intelligence and how they mine some of the analytics around what's going on in their network will then translate into new architectural approaches and different models. So I mean, yeah, we didn't break the internet. I mean, we always try and give it a damn good, a good try with new applications, but we're doing okay. Just you know, a little bit of data to kind of just expand on the consumption. Now, the graphic on the left is not access related, it's aggregation. I took this obviously from the 8th of April. I think we were meant to do this presentation a little while earlier. But the AMX Internet Exchange peaked at 10 terabytes. You say, well, why? You know, why is that significant? Well, it did kind of underpin the use of the growing and seems to be unfettered increase in bandwidth usage, and it just gives an aggregated view of that. If you look at this over the last 5 years, it's an incredible rate of growth. The challenge, the message there for the service provider is, well, if we're consuming as end users, this is, you know, what's the monetization model for that? And I'm not going to offer anything in this short presentation, but, you know, we're there to try and help service providers, you know, give them that thought kind of leadership in terms of how they can monetize that, or at least extract cost out of the business. If we maintain that trajectory, moving out another 2 years, you know, maybe we're talking 30, 40, 50 terabytes. The other graphic on the right is the usage of how we're consuming it in the home. I don't consider myself in my home a typical usage, but my consumption is way over the 200, 250 gig per month. Where it goes, I have no clue, but you know, the average household is consuming 38 times the bandwidth that we were only 10 years ago. And 10 years, you know, in the environment that we work in, I mean, an internet year is a dog year, right? It's worth 7 years in terms of how things are progressing, either consumption models, apps are driving it, architectures, etc. So, you know, average 344 gig per household. Now, the mind boggles. Most of us probably grew up in the era of dial-up modems. And to think even a gig at that point was quite a reach out number. So, you know, the strap line at the bottom, you know, 10 to the power 3, well, it's not, you know, this is, you know, 10 years, we're at 10 terabytes, you know, does this provide that, you know, emphasis and impetus to get to 10 gig access? And that's kind of like the key message. Now, I want to just draw the comparison between what I call access and service. I'm not advocating a 10 gig service at this point in time. I don't think we're at that stage. But if I look at it in terms of access equals a utility, you know, you don't measure the water that comes out your water pipe, you just get charged for, you don't measure the diameter of it, you just get charged for what you use. So, you know, there is this kind of race towards 10 gig and some of the architectures quickly that we will kind of be expanding on really, you know, satisfies that demand and gives the platform and foundation moving forward. There are dynamics in the market that are consuming bandwidth, as you would expect, but also a lot of changing dynamics that, as I just mentioned before, the utilitarian approach to ubiquitous broadband access, the race to 10 gig. There seems to be you know, a race of how quick we can get to symmetrical capacity and capability. Can we use it at the moment? Maybe not, but that is the, you know, that's the goal. The changing landscape in the service provider space. I know there's lots of service providers out there. Maybe you can either critique it or challenge me on this, but there is no such thing as a verticalized service provider anymore. If we look at, you know, an MSO or a cable operator, cable operators are not just cable operators anymore. They're full service operators. They're CSPs. They're looking at fixed mobile convergence. They're looking at, you know, augmenting, you know, some elements of PON and other symmetrical services. And, you know, I'm not ruling out 5G. And, you know, the news today around the merger between O2 in the UK and Virgin Media actually stands testament to that. But this is happening worldwide. We would have heard of the fourth industrial revolution around machine-to-machine connectivity and intelligence, IoT and sensors all talking and relying on internet connectivity. Some of the currency around that is around low latency. That seems to be the new kind of currency in the internet. And a lot of these applications will require highly reliable and low latency type environments. And then that's something that we're teasing out of the environments in terms of architectures, and that's going to be the kind of top of mind for a lot of applications moving forward. As I mentioned, low latency and ultra reliability. As I mentioned, the work from home, the enterprise extension, there is no reason why the facilities and everything that you enjoy within the workplace cannot now be driven down into the home. Distributed call centers, just the enterprise workforce, even, dealing desks, etc. From the city, as the city closed down in terms of some of the banks and financial houses, all require those kind of low latency reliability elements, but there's no reason now that the distributed workforce can't leverage some of the technology to a greater effect and to enhance productivity rather than just a me too, I can do it type approach. So things happening there. Consumption models are changing. What we're kind of listening to in terms of our service provider, as a service will become the new model. It may not be there now. We're very much in that CapEx hardware kind of environment. But as service providers change their consumption habits in terms of how they buy services from either the vendors or even the cloud operators from the web scale guys, they're going to request for new models. And this is something that we will engage into our add into our own product portfolios as well. And then other elements around fixed mobile convergence and some of the stimulus that's happening in the market to drive specifically FTTH, certainly in the European market, a lot of CapEx inflow to provide that bridge across the digital divide and provide ultra fast broadband. Busy slide again. I know we are ramping up down that drag race strip and getting a little bit faster. But one of the areas that we're focusing on, and I know the UK and Europe are focusing on broadband access speeds in a number of areas to as I said, to bridge that digital divide, is around fiber to the home. It's not a new phenomenon. I mean, this has been around for almost 2 decades now, or at least a decade and a half. ATM morphed into a PON type environment from a MAC layer, and the first forays into PON were around an ATM based cell type structure, and then that kind of evolved into GPON. The GPON in a ITUT base, I should have mentioned there's 2 camps around PON architectures. One is the IEEE, which favors very much the evolution around the cable space, and the ITU is very much favored around the telco space. But at the end of the day, they have similar goals in terms of providing symmetrical type services. So GPON has been the kind of foundation for a long time now. It's still very relevant in the market and providing a lot of competition in terms of broadband access speed against G.fast and even some of the cable technologies as well. There's going to be a little bit of a jump probably towards an XGS PON environment. I think we'll just miss out the XG-PON, which is the non-symmetrical 10 gig approach to a symmetrical, i.e. the symmetrical 10 gig approach. This will become the de facto standard in the ITU space. And we're seeing a lot of activity around that moving forward in terms of either the overbuilders or the telcos changing their environment to more moving away from the copper pair. And then moving forward, well, I think the jury's still out a little bit because there's a lot of activity around 50 gig in both the IEEE and ITUT space. But what we know now is around multi-wavelength technology. NG-PON2 is a 4 lambdas delivering in excess of 40 gig to provide higher speeds. Jury's still out how much market acceptance NG-PON2 will get, or maybe it will jump to a more structured 50 gig type approach. There's also a lot of work around 25 gig as well. And operators, maybe like yourself, are deciding who are in the PON space, do we go from 10 to 25, or do we go from 10 and we miss out another jump and we go to 50 or higher speeds? The above approach is similar, but this is EPON, which is IEEE. A similar approach, the de facto point in the IEEE is around the 10 gig EPON structure, but also has a very strong path of direction towards 50 gig EPON and 25 gig EPON. Not advocating either of these both have their unique use cases in the world, but there is a choice for operators to use either or. A bit of a busy slide, but in terms of the central office environment and how that is changing, and this very much relates to some of the ITU space. But on the left-hand side here, the traditional vendor silo is very much a rack and stack. You build up a layer from an optical line terminating equipment. You have either a switch layer. On top of that, you have either a BRAS or a BNG that does all the subscriber management and policy. And where we are today is this kind of green box here is the transition to 10 gig. Now, it may still employ some of the old model, but this is an opportunity for the service provider space and the vendor space and the cloud space to start looking at how we disaggregate. Now, I throw that word in, disaggregation, because it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And hopefully I'll explain that. It is a case of breaking out the component parts of the architecture and either putting them in the cloud, putting them on COTS-based or commercially off-the-shelf compute, and running different models. I'm not going to go into what those models are in much detail, but disaggregation is the key word here, and also the transition to 10 gig. Virtualization also plays a big part. Now, a well-used term, but we need to understand what that brings in terms of the benefit to an operator. And we start bringing, sorry for the acronyms, but splitting out layers of the OLT, the OMCI, the vault management function, and we start looking at where we position those in the network. Is it smart that we put them in the cloud to amortize management functions across multiple network elements? Or do we leave them in the service provider's central office and maybe provide a hybrid type environment and amortize control plane and management functions across multiple network entities? The choice is out there. The reason why you have that choice is that we're taking the approach around disaggregation. Otherwise, you'll be locked into the orange graphic on the left. And then moving forward, how we mine some of that network intelligence and automation. If I was a CTIO, I'd be thinking about, I don't want to go through another pandemic. I want to automate everything. I want zero touch provisioning. I want a digitized supply chain that the CPE comes straight from the customer, from the vendor straight to the customer, plugs it in, and it brings up the service. I don't want to be touching it. And those are the two models that, the foundation gives us the opportunity to work towards. And we call it a utopian view around what the ultimate network would be in terms of being an analytic and data-driven network. And exploring some 10 gig architectures, this gets a bit busy, so please stick with me. I said we're ramping up and accelerating down the drag race. But if I just do a quick comparison between a telco stack type architecture and then compare it to a cable environment, there are three separate elements here. The OLT is a standalone box. It contains all the PHY layer and the MAC layer, along with the scheduling for bandwidth allocation, along with all the higher order elements around control plane for layer 2 and some of the data plane and all the management functions. So this all sits within the OLT. Now we then compare that, we northbound that and interface that into a pre-aggregation layer or aggregation layer of layer 2 environments. And again, you have a control plane, layer 2, data plane, etc., as you would expect. And then northbound of that, you would have a BNG, or broadband network gateway, which does all the smart stuff around traffic management, subscriber policy, and basically, provides that whole layer of IP services. If I compare that now, or the comparison I draw is what we were doing in the cable space. Now, it's quite convenient, isn't it, that the CCAP platform that we know does all of the above, or all of the elements on the left. It very much was a central office in a box, a head end in a box, where it did all the elements. Now, if we can apply that same kind of approach in the PON space and drive some of the benefits from that, I think we're in a good position from an industry, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to. It's a bit of a contradiction. We want to disaggregate all these elements. We want to put all these different coloured boxes in different areas of the network, be it in the cloud, on premise. But then we want to do is wrap a nice warm wrapper around that to make the management and control of that network seem very seamless. Why do we do that? It's because we want to offer the choice to the SP, to the telco, that they can pick any one of these elements from another vendor. I know it seems very strange to say that as a vendor, but that they can cherry pick what element comes from what vendor. Now, this gets a little bit busier, and apologies up front, but it does get quite complicated. This is our target architecture. It did build, but what we've done here, and I won't dwell on it for too long, but it is there for reference. We're disaggregating all the elements in the OLT and in the BNG. So that's on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we're actually putting this into a disaggregated format. So the switch fabric that I showed on the telco stack is referenced here by the spine switch and leaf switch environment. Also, this could be a data center interconnect, a data center type of environment. So we've actually taken the backplane and we put this into a leaf spine environment. And as we go through some of these functions, if I look at some of the OLT functions, we've taken out some of the control plane and management functions, and then we've put that in a standalone environment in an SDN cloud. So this is a way of extracting some of the control planes and management functions, putting them into the cloud, and then having those elements have a direct southbound view of all the network, all the hardware elements that sit below it. It gives the operators an opportunity to use this environment here and amortize that across multiple physical elements at the bottom. This slide did build, but I think something's missing in the presentation, but it does build on the slide. And then at the bottom here, the physical entities remain intact. So these will always remain on-prem. And it gives the opportunity for a telco to say, well, I tell you what, Mr. Vendor, we'll take the network elements from you, but we want you or a cloud environment to manage all the management across that, be it the management plane, the control plane, and the insurance, which is not referenced here, the assurance of the services as well. So it gives the operator a choice of moving forward in terms of how they re-architect that. Why would they do that? They want to drive a level of automation that they cannot do across a disparate environment with a telco stack. So it's a very busy slide. It's a lot to take on board. So if there are any questions about that, please do stop moving forward. I think I
have a couple in, and I think you've mentioned them in parts. So just probably more summaries if I can. One's coming kind of out of the chat, and one was kind of submitted beforehand. So conscious you covered quite a bit in the last couple of slides. So I'm going to ask just more of as a summary. So one that has come in is, how does CommScope aim to simplify the disaggregation of networks? Surely an all in the box approach would be easier to manage. And I know you've mentioned bits, so just maybe a summary for that one.
I think if I answer the second part of that question first, our approach is that we will disaggregate networks and we will wrap it round in a box. Now, the opportunity or the advantage of taking that approach is, as you develop your network, you can then start decoupling those elements without a massive forklift change to the way you operate that. So day one, we'll disaggregate it from a software construct, but we'll actually put it in a box. That means you can benefit from future evolution without having to change your path of direction in terms of leveraging cloud infrastructure or any disaggregation. If you are very much tilting to let's disaggregate it all now and then put these disparate parts in the cloud, hybrid, public, or whatever, it operates in exactly the same way. So you can distribute how you wish. You can either have it fully distributed or you can have it within the box. The choice is down to the operator. And what we're doing is making sure that we offer that choice without cul-de-sacking an operator into any particular architectural avenue without being able to change direction. So that's the reason why we're doing that.
Awesome. And Paul, just one more, once again, I think a bit of a summary. So it's, how do you see the use of the cloud enhancing CommScope's offering?
Very much in line with what I've said, the use of the cloud, and I use that in a generic term, it could be private, public, or edge. You know, we would look and work with operators to say, well, you know, what makes sense? What is the opportunity to take workloads away from an on-prem environment that are causing you operational headaches, stick them up into the cloud, whatever that cloud would be, and maybe manage it as a service. You know, the ultimate view is we would like our service provider customers to manage their customers, and then we would manage their network for them. So it gives them their focus on that. Now, it's a bit of a utopian view, but that is the opportunity that we have ahead of us.
Awesome, thank you. I'll give you probably a 5 minute as well, just to give Jerome time to get on stage as well. So I think we've only got,
sure, that's 5 minutes. I think this is just my last one, and this is just before we get across the finish line on the drag race, because we're not positioning anything as a standalone, you know, vertical silo stack in terms of PON, DOCSIS, or wherever. There is a common point, a convergence point. That convergence point is a higher order point, and that's around that SDN control layer. As we look to split out functions from an appliance and we start putting elements at that layer. So, you know, the purpose of this is to really kind of expand on the thoughts that, you know, the industry, I say the industry, but obviously CommScope, you know, we're influential in that. We're positioning it very much in a holistic environment where we talk about different access technologies, PON, wireless, DOCSIS, dare I say DSL in some extents, the SIN, and then we look at how we can simplify this from a command and management perspective. So we're looking at, you know, how we split out some of the control planes and introduce this into a software-defined environment. For those who are involved in the DOCSIS environment, FMA is, or the flexible MAC architecture work groups, is doing exactly the same as Broadband Forum is doing in the PON space in terms of taking out those higher orders. And there's going to be some commonality around driving interoperability and frictionless interoperability around having common northbound interfaces, common open standard network protocols like NetConf-Yang, and everything being modeled and telemetry driven. That's where we're going. There is also not the concern, but the consideration to make sure legacy equipment is also, you know, brought along for the ride in that. And there are benefits in that, and how we can provide that into providing certain levels of translation and abstraction. So we're providing an evolutionary path of direction for both PON and DOCSIS. I'm not going to go down the DOCSIS because I don't want to take Jeroen's thunder away. And then even northbound of this is around orchestration and automation. So this kind of brings it all together. So we're not looking at it in a siloed environment for PON versus DOCSIS versus SIN or wireless. We're looking at it at this point in the network evolution, very much a holistic view. Pulling it together down at a physical layer, as you would expect. We show this because there is some similarity to how we architect from the DOCSIS perspective. Down at the physical layer in terms of boxes on the left-hand side, we have a layer 2, layer 3, aggregation, pre-aggregation kind of environment. Northbound of that, we provide all the management type functions. Now this can be on-prem, on x86 hardware, or in the cloud. Access out to an OLT. This can be in central office, excuse me, central office or head end, or out in the outside plant to provide whatever the 10 gig variant that we're offering at that point in time. And then out through the PON environment, obviously PON does exactly what it says on the tin. It's always going to remain passive, I hope. To simplify it, we'll put all the network element intelligence in a environment where we can manage it, and then out to a CPE or home in terms of to provide that service. CP discussions maybe for later, but in terms of providing that bridge ONU and residential gateway functionality as a two-box solution, or in some cases a full-blown residential gateway. So this is the kind of, I mean, trying to just simplify it. The complexity is in this gentleman here in this box, and the Vault Manager as referenced by the previous two slides, and obviously the SIN. When it comes down to it, we still look at a simplified approach, and the question was asked about the disaggregation. Is it in the box? Is it partially, you know, splitting out some of the backplane, or is it, as the previous slide showed, totally disaggregated? But this is our view, and I think with that, I think this is my last slide. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them now. If not, I will hand over to my friend Jeroen.
I think we're all on track for questions at the moment, so I'll give you a breather. Just while we swap slides over and Jeroen can take control, I'm just going to do a very quick intro, just so for those that don't know him. Oh, click the wrong button. Where's it gone? Cool. So yeah, just while we swap the slides around, so quick introduction for Jeroen Butsis. So Jeroen, for over 20 years, has been a senior technical sales engineering professional in the fixed access networks domain. He has held various engineering positions ranging from individual contributor to senior management, and he's currently vice president at CommScope, responsible for network sales engineering and solution architecture for EMEA. A track record of helping customers innovate, transform and future-proof cable access networks, enabling European cable MSOs to deliver multi-gigabit services, leveraging technologies such as DOCSIS 3.1, over integrated or distributed access architectures. A strong technical background in DOCSIS, ICCAP, DCCAP, HFC, IP, video, DVB, IPTV, NFV, and cloud technologies. He holds a Bachelor of Electrical and Telecommunications Engineering degree from KH Lim in Belgium. And with that introduction over, Jeroen, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Hope you can see my introduction slide here, okay? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, lovely. Not that this is obviously absolutely necessary, but it could be useful. I'm not able to switch on the camera, but I think the host of this session can do that. Yeah, okay, lovely. That seems to work fine. Thanks so much, appreciate it. So again, a very warm welcome again, and thank you, Dave, for taking us through this. This part of the presentation really focuses more on the 10G or path to 10G journey, you could say. So we see the path to 10G really as I said, it's really a journey from our perspective. So along the journey, there's, as always, there is different options, intersections, different paths and decisions and choices to make with regards to how MSOs can expand network bandwidth across their network. So again, there's different options and choices to make, and probably also those happen through different stages and phases over time. And the real objective, aim, and name of the game effectively is really to be able to stay ahead of consumer demand. That is obviously the key goal, of course, here as well. Now, whilst you could say that primarily my part of the presentation here following Dave's, you could say focuses primarily on the current and future development, excuse me, for cable access and 10 gig delivery. It really also has to be said indeed that 10G really spans across a multi-domain fixed access network environment. So obviously, as Dave said, inclusive of PON, inclusive of other technologies such as wireless technologies as well. Now, let's maybe take a minute or so to talk a little bit about the 10 gig drivers. What is driving this, of course. The first one is really, you could say, all about more scalability. I mean, everyone knows that the number of devices within the home that consume broadband connectivity is continuing to grow. That's obviously continuing going forward, and that we see not change, obviously, as expected. So we need to build the networks, also the networks within the home, that will be able to sustain and support that going forward. With the need for more security, security concerns and risks, there is an ongoing need for better and improved security. And again, this is not just about securing the MSO's networks, but equally so, it is also about securing the network within the home as well. Reliability within networks has always been a big theme with many operators. Of course, naturally, that's the case. But again, given the sheer volume of bandwidth and advanced services and capabilities, and I think also the reliance on the networks is becoming larger and larger ever than it has been before. Reliability will increasingly become or be important going forward. So we need to build mature, reliable networks in future going forward, as well as we have been in the past. Lower latency, Dave alluded to this as well. Edge computing, low latency DOCSIS are big themes. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But it is really all there with an objective to be able to improve the user experience ultimately, in terms of how the consumer is able to, enjoy their service and leverage their services. Obviously, last but not least, this whole journey towards 10 gig is really also obviously about being able to provide more bandwidth, more capacity to the network, which then I think will help MSOs also deliver new services on their networks, such as, for example, symmetrical services, things like mobile backhaul, enterprise backhaul, lots of capabilities that become available in terms of new services, enabling new services. So now, having said all of this, I think let us next take a look at some of the what we call network bandwidth augmentation options that are available today, not as in future, but today, and how we can begin to leverage those as and when we plan or begin to evolve networks in future towards DOCSIS 4.0 capability. So I'll build up the slide here, ladies and gentlemen, in a minute. But if you look at, for example, today, the bandwidth augmentation options, those we're showing on the chart here, it's pretty broad, it's pretty exhaustive. These are all options that operators may decide to choose from in terms of their implementation and options that can help them with the evolution of the network. So some operators may choose, to go with some of these options or a combination of these options. At the end of the day, the ultimate true objective here is to be able to increase network efficiency, obviously capacity, ability to offer higher speeds on the cable access plant, and the ability to improve customer UX. So if we kind of walk through some of these bandwidth augmentation options, I'll touch on a few ones. And I think what we'll see, or what we're actually seeing in the market today, is doing most customers nowadays, is when we look at node segmentation, to take one example, or node splits, these are very often nowadays, at least, happening in tandem, in combination, as it were, with deploying DAA solutions as well. That in turn typically goes in hand also with looking at ways to expand the upstream spectrum in the upstream to 204 megahertz, equally so in the forward part to 1.2 gigahertz. Obviously, as part of this DOCSIS 3.1 enablement and the expansion of DOCSIS 3.1 spectrum remains a key important tool in all of this. Not just now, but we also believe in future as and when we migrate and move towards DOCSIS 4.0 as well. Now, I talked a little bit about customer user experience. What we're seeing, certainly we as CommScope, since the last, you could say 6-9 months-ish or so, is a lot of interest from the market in Europe around low latency DOCSIS. There's quite a few customers that are now very seriously looking at that, doing certain testing, ecosystem end-to-end testing, and they're looking at ways of implementing those capabilities on their networks. And again, these are all options that can be considered now ahead of a DOCSIS 4.0 adoption in future. What we are hearing and what customers are sharing with us is that some customers are really looking to offer low latency DOCSIS services as, we could say, a value add based service, which will be helping operators to generate new additional revenue streams. It's quite important, obviously. Secondly, other operators may decide to deploy LLD capabilities to be able to offer a very similar user experience across both cable access and fiber access. So different use cases, different intents, where LLD is, I think, highly valuable. Let me maybe talk a little bit more about DOCSIS 3.1. Obviously, you know, a lot of customers have a very significant, sizable implementation of DOCSIS 3.1 across their networks, both in the downstream and the upstream nowadays. So where we see a slight shift in focus is now, whilst you have 3.1 capability on the network, how can we, or how can operators leverage the DOCSIS 3.1 capabilities even more, even further? So the topic around bandwidth optimization and improving DOCSIS 3.1 efficiency is a key topic of discussion that we're daily involved in with operators. So being able to leverage tools that enable us to optimize DOCSIS 3.1 deployments is, again, I think, a key important tool as part of this journey to 10G. Reclaiming bandwidth from legacy services with the shift to IP or OTT IP delivery is obviously a theme and a trend that continues to progress as we move forward over time. And again, that allows us to implement or to reallocate parts of the spectrum for IP delivery as opposed to QAM delivery over time as well. So again, that's another option that is available today for consideration. Now, as all of these options are options that can be leveraged, implemented, considered today in this path, or in this journey towards 10G, this is obviously, you know, what can be done today. Now, when we consider the future, and in particular DOCSIS 4.0, DOCSIS 4.0 is really enabling a gradual and gradual and responsible adoption of DOCSIS 4.0 technology. Can really help operators to implement even greater capacity in the upstream and in the downstream. The upstream up to 5 gig and the downstream up to 10 gig. So that's obviously very substantial in this path to 10G. So this next chart, we'll talk a little bit about DOCSIS 4.0, not too long, but just a brief intro for maybe some folks that may not be highly familiar just yet with 4.0. So DOCSIS 4.0 is a specification that was defined by obviously Cable Labs in close collaboration with what is often being referred to as the band of 20 Msos and the vendor community. And 4.0 obviously does offer a defined path to 10G. So the specifications were, or let's say, finalized, delivered in the first quarter of 2020 last year. And you could say at high level, 4.0 comes in two different flavors or types. On one hand, you have extended spectrum DOCSIS, ESD, which really extends the RF spectrum to 1.2, or let's say from 1.2 gigahertz better to 1.8 gigahertz. ESD does support N+X HFC plant architectures, which we believe is a very good fit and good option for most of the European MSOs. The other flavor, the second one, is full duplex DOCSIS, FDX. FDX maintains the RF spectrum up to 1.2 gigahertz, but it does include extensions for the upstream to extend the upstream bandwidth. FDX is more targeted at N+0 networks, so HFC network architectures that are based on an N+0 target architecture. So here, let's take a look at the DOCSIS 4.0 extended spectrum plans. And this is really a chart where we'd like to illustrate to you how operators in future can begin with a gradual adoption of DOCSIS 4.0, extended spectrum DOCSIS 4.0, that is, and how the channel or spectrum plan can evolve over time. And again, this is just an illustration, an example of how a potential spectrum plan, migration plan better can look like going forward. So as I mentioned on the previous chart, ESD extends the spectrum from 1.2 to 1.8 gigahertz. That's obviously quite significant extension and change. DOCSIS 4.0, also ESD in particular, does allow for a gradual migration of the upstream spectrum. So, for example, operators that are deploying a 204 plant today, they may wish to add additional 96 megahertz parts of upstream spectrum to their plans going forward over time. Over time, as in when obviously bandwidth and capacity demands call for it. So that is definitely possible. Now, there's different intersections or steps in between, as in 204 megahertz and ultimately a full DOCSIS 4.0 ESD configuration that is leveraging a return spectrum of 684 megahertz. So again, it gives customers the option to gradually transition towards full DOCSIS 4.0 ESD over time, as and when it makes sense to them, of course. So I think we talked about the MSO HFC plant target architectures, and I think this is an important topic to highlight here. So let's maybe spend a few minutes on this. So here we're looking at what we at CommScope refer to as the taxonomy of the DOCSIS 4.0 chipset choices that for operators to make, whilst considering, you could say, the availability of the DOCSIS 4.0 technologies that are currently known by the industry. That's a long sentence. I'll clarify on this chart what that effectively truly means. So again, let's first look at what is the envisioned target HFC plant architecture that the MSO has in mind in terms of their preference. So you could say that for N+0 networks, FDX may certainly present a good option to the operator. For N+X networks, extended spectrum DOCSIS has many benefits to offer as well. Whilst obviously DOCSIS 4.0 supports both remote PHY and remote MAC-PHY architectures, there's a couple of specific points that we need to highlight here as part of this chart and presentation to you today. So I think, as most of you know, FDX chips are for the RPD and cable modems are currently under development, and we have highlighted some of the timelines in terms of when we envision samples to become available and product to become a GA in future. So you can see those here on the chart. So, so I think this is pretty well defined, certainly when it comes to FDX and RPD technology and timelines and chipset availability. There's still a couple of unknowns here, and I'll quickly go through this here and build up the chart. But essentially, you could say also the same is true for ESD. So ESD chips are in the development as well for remote MAC-PHY architectures. So what that also means is that at this point in time, there's no publicly announced chipsets for FDX and remote MAC-PHY architectures. And again, the same is true for ESD and remote PHY architectures. So what that means effectively is that really depending on the MSO HFC target HFC planned target architecture, there's two choices that MSOs at this point in time have in terms of moving towards either a FDX plus RPD network and architecture or an extended spectrum DOCSIS based with remote MAC-PHY type of architecture. So I think these are pretty key, important decision points to make going forward. And again, this is all based on today's view on the world in terms of where the industry is at today, in terms of our visibility on chipsets currently under development and for which target architectures and what type of DOCSIS 4.0 flavors. So again, it's not a an easy journey or three to kind of navigate through each of these options as pros and cons, and certainly we're very keen to help work with you and operators to navigate you through these different many options and complex options. So okay, now next.
Just drop in quickly. Conscious of time, just quickly to the kind of audience. Conscious we're just about to hit the hour mark. Obviously, we're going to continue on for a bit because we've got quite a few questions. Just I'll probably raise at the end of this. For anyone that does absolutely need to drop off, we will be sharing the recording out. So please come back and kind of watch back the bit you did miss. And obviously, if you've got any questions, just submit them before you do drop off, and we'll try and get them answered for you. I'm just going to raise a quick couple of questions, if I can, to you, Owen, before we kind of continue on. One that's come in. Could we have a distance range per frequency spectrum for DOCSIS 4? What spectrum is preferable for lower equipment cost?
Yeah, so I think that's obviously very good question. I think what in general what we tend to see, at least for now, as we see it and understand it, is that obviously most of the current legacy, if you could call it legacy, DOCSIS 3.0 or SC-QAM PHY channels, including the services that obviously ride on top, they will very likely continue to reside within the existing RF spectrum band. And that's obviously for legacy reasons important going forward. Although obviously the upstream spectrum moves up quite a bit into the almost 700 megahertz range. It's certainly the intent to keep the legacy services kind of residing in the spectrum where they live today, and to deploy OFDM in the higher parts of the band leading up to 1.8 gigahertz. Probably that will happen in conjunction with in the higher part of the spectrum, meaning as in above 1.2, 1.3 gigahertz, leveraging OFDM, maybe at a lower, certainly I think is going to be the case at the lower order modulation rate, order better. So I think we've been doing quite a bit of testing in that particular regard since I think the first testing that we did and that we announced, I think in one of the SCTE presentations and shows back in 2015, where we showed, I think at the time it was 6 gig delivery. I think it was a gigabits per second delivery that we managed to showcase. We've done quite an extensive white paper on that. It certainly can be shared. I'm not sure who asked the question, but maybe yourself or Melissa can take note, and we can make sure that we provide more inside details on that.
Thank you. I'll let you continue.
Okay. Okay, so let's, in the essence of time, let's maybe quickly go through a brief overview of flexible MAC architectures, which we also believe is really essential in this journey to 10G. So what is FMA? Very quickly, I think you probably know it's another Cable Labs working group, which is developing another set of specifications, of which the first set of specifications were released last year. What does it provide? It does define the aggregation of the management and control plane, as well as standardizing both the northbound and the southbound interfaces for distributed access architectures. Key objectives, you can see them here on the chart. I'm not going to read through all of these, but essentially what this provides is that we believe, is going to be a key enabler to provide the level of vendor independence and equipment interoperability by standardizing on these northbound and southbound interfaces. In terms of target architectures, FMA is obviously and will be supporting both remote PHY and remote MAC PHY type of architectures at this present time, based on the current spec of specifications or set of specifications that have been released already. We are looking at, or FMA is supporting first remote MAC PHY, and at a later stage remote PHY architectures. We'll cover both, but there's a sequence order: remote MAC PHY first and remote PHY at a later point in time. So what we're showing here on this next chart is a illustration of a network or an access network example that is based on a remote MAC PHY RMD device, and how this evolution can look like in terms of an evolution towards an FMA compliant architecture. This is a very high level one. We're showing only the key building blocks to kind of illustrate the concept. So on the right hand side of the chart, we have, as I mentioned, an RMD node, can be a shelf as well. And with the key, you could say, networking functions highlighted in the different colored boxes. On the left hand side, we have the traditional existing video and DOCSIS, OSS, BSS, and NMS management systems currently deployed by the MSO. Now, with the evolution towards FMA, what we're actually doing is we are aggregating both the management and the control plane into an SDN management layer. And I'll just build up the slides here so you can kind of see how that transpires as part of this migration. And as part of doing that, as I mentioned, both the northbound and southbound interfaces between this SDN management control layer on one hand into the legacy or existing back-office systems, those interfaces are leveraging existing interfaces that are open and standards based, but also leveraging some new interfaces as well. And the same is true for the southbound interfaces between the SDN layer and effectively the physical cable equipment that we're showing here, in this case, the RMD on the right-hand side. Okay, now you may think, okay, well, this is hopefully well understood and clear. What are the benefits, for such architecture evolution to cable MSO? So we'll touch on that here on this next chart. So key benefits of this combination of remote MAC PHY in combination with FMA, in our view, our opinion is it's really geared towards simplifying the DA network. Certainly with remote MAC PHY, there's no necessity requirement for deploying PTP time synchronization across the network. It also takes away a significant degree of complex integration that otherwise may be required, certainly in multi-vendor environment with remote PHY. I think this journey towards FMA also does provide a pretty well-defined path towards network function virtualization as well, but in a standardized way based on open and standardized based interfaces. So I think that that should be really helping MSOs in that journey. In terms of scalability, one of the nice benefits, certainly also with remote MAC-PHY, is the fact that you have all of the MAC compute resources residing within the RMD device itself, sitting at the edge of the network. Obviously, understandably, operators may not be able to leverage or need the full MAC processing capacity day one, but certainly the devices being deployed now are capable of supporting those for the bandwidth requirements that are needed between now and the future. So that's a key benefit as well. We talked about customer UX on a couple of topics here, but this is another one that's coming back with moving the MAC scheduling and the MAC function towards really the edge of the network. So things like low latency of edge computing are certainly one of the key other benefits to tap into it within this evolution. Also, I mentioned optimized evolution plan to 4.0. That means with extended spectrum DOCSIS, I think is what we see really, a nice good fit for many European operators, when considering and looking at the current HFC architectures that are being deployed out there today, which are typically an N+6, N+5, maybe N+4 network today, but with an envisioned target to maybe look at more of a network in future that's reliant on an N+2 network, for example, maybe some cases N+1. So ESD, I think, is probably a very good fit for most operators across the region. And this is my last slide here. Similar to today's, but maybe, but here in this case, more focused on cable access, of course, and DOCSIS 4.0. What we're showing is the remote MAC-PHY high-level networking diagram, where we're illustrating the virtualized management and control plane, which is moved centralized into an aggregation layer, SDN layer within the network, within the data center. And then we obviously at the edge of the network, we have our DOCSIS 4.0 ESD node with RMD device. Obviously, the devices in the network, in the HFC or RF network plant are illustrating here 1.8 gigahertz capabilities in terms of the RF amps and taps and amplifiers. So that's it. I think in short, I hope this was informative, and certainly welcome any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. I've saved a few questions that have come in via chat and a couple submitted before, and kind of I'm going to open this up to both you and Dave, and just kind of, by all means jump in. So if you're all right, we'll have a quick fire round of questions, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So as more traditional cable operators leverage the use of both PON and DOCSIS, how do you see this playing out? Will there be a clear winner between the two?
So Dave, I'll take that one, and feel free to comment to this. So I mean, my personal view, and I think that's also CommScope's position on this, is that we see that there's a time and space for both options, and it really depends on what is for the MSO in particular the most appropriate, the most suitable mid to longer term network evolution plan and strategy that really makes the most sense for the operator itself. Some operators have a clear defined path that this is PON ultimately, and obviously steering investments accordingly. Other operators are looking at really, extending the cable access network further, digitizing it further, but moving to fiber deep, digital fiber deep type of DAA architectures as well, in combination with PON also. So, I think it's really depending on the operator itself. I think we see that there's a strong market for both, and will continue to be going forward. And I think the beauty of this is that as we're really focusing on both access architectures and the solutions around that, cable and PON, it gives operators, I think, a good choice and flexibility to choose from to help evolve their networks, or maybe parts of the network in one direction, other parts of the network into another direction. We are seeing that too. So, long story short, I think, in my opinion, it's less of one versus the other. It's more likely a combination of the two where it makes sense. So, Dave, any comments from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up extremely well there. We're not positioning this as a PON versus DOCSIS or DOCSIS versus PON or King Kong versus Godzilla type environment. There's going to be specific use cases that drive the requirement. So, I mean, obviously, an MSO who have invested billions in terms of HFC infrastructure, there's going to be maybe a light touch evolution path to augment and complement the DOCSIS network, maybe, new infill areas. Likewise, we wouldn't go to a telco and start promoting DOCSIS as a way forward for broadband access. So, there is a very much a use case driven requirement on this one. But Jeroen, you said it all.
Cool, awesome. So now around DOCSIS 4. So just a question once again to both, and by all means jump in. How and when does CommScope see most EMEA MSOs to begin with the adoption of DOCSIS 4.0?
Thanks. I think so. Basically, the how. Let me start maybe there first. I think I alluded to this in my presentation a couple of times. We do firmly believe that extended spectrum DOCSIS is probably, and this is not to to overdo or to discredit FDX in any shape or form, but I think really looking at the history, the legacy, the current architecture of the HFC plants, in most cases, most MSOs, ESD is, I think, providing a good evolution path going forward. So I think within the context of that, there's quite a few suppliers that are now offering 1.8 gigahertz capable products, RF splitters, amplifiers, passives, and so on. Products are really going to, becoming available now, you could say, and operators deciding to begin implementing those this year and next year. So I think from that perspective, it is, relatively well defined. In terms of the active solutions, as in the remote MAC-PHY and remote PHY solutions, and those solutions supporting DOCSIS 4.0, we're really looking at timelines around the end of 2022 in terms of really deployments taking off in 2023. And again, this is obviously highly dependent on chipset availability, maturity of the technology, readiness for deployment, and sample availability and whatnot. So there's, it's quite a bit of steps to go through, I think, and this is not the case just for CommScope, but we believe for the industry, quite a journey also to get through. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, thank you very much. Anything to add, Dave, or are ready for the next one?
Jeroen's the expert on that.
Yeah, that's cool. So this one around the kind of HFC to FTTH move. So how can MSOs reuse their HFC network infrastructure, for instance, DOCS cabinets, to build up a fiber to the home network?
Maybe just
does that make sense? Sorry, yeah. I'll say it again. Yeah. So how can MSOs reuse their HFC network infrastructure, such as DOCS and cabinets, to best build up a fiber to the home network?
Well, I think part of that question has been answered in the previous questions. I mean, from a DOCSIS perspective, if you have an underlying infrastructure and you need to maybe do some level of subscriber shedding, and you think the use case is more cost effective to utilize the ducts and cabinets to provide small islands of PON to just alleviate DOCSIS service group splitting and the cost associated with that, maybe there's a point there. But the approach that us and probably other vendors are taking is that we're building infrastructure in both the central office and a hardened approach. So the hardened approach can go out in the outside plant. If it complements that particular use case that I just meant, well then, you know, there is the approach there. I hope I answered the question. I think that's what.
That's cool. That's cool. One just come in on the Q&A, and either or. So do you, as in CommScope, have a solution based on radio base station to reach areas where cable or fiber infrastructure are not available?
So
Yeah, go on in, Yuri.
yeah, so I mean, in short, very good question. We certainly do have the radio technologies that we do, solutions we have available in terms of the radio itself. In terms of the actual base stations, we don't as such, but we have a pretty, you know, in terms of outdoor wireless solutions, a pretty broad, extensive solution set that we can definitely offer. So yeah, certainly if there's any specific more information that we can help to provide, more than happy to share, you know, or help, you know, point folks to additional information. So again, maybe for you, James or Melissa, if you could, you know, note down the request, and then we can reach out to the individual requester and provide additional insight here. But yes, certainly we have a pretty extensive portfolio in this domain. Yeah.
Awesome. And some of the other questions that had come in, I think we've answered kind of quite comfortably throughout. So I think from my point, I will wrap it up there from a questioning point of view. Obviously, anything final, I think Tony will close off, but by all means, submit any questions after and we can see if we can still get them answered. But just a quick one from me to both Dave, Owen, thank you very much. Really interesting and really insightful, and to everyone, thanks for your questions. And I'm going to hand back over to Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much, Dave and Jeroen. A great walkthrough of this. Thanks for all the three-letter acronyms. I won't use the three-letter acronym for that. It makes it a lot easier. But thank you both very much for that. James, a well-deserved bit of water there. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Thank you all very much. If there are any questions, please put them in the survey at the end. And if we need to, we'll get Dave and Jeroen back and we'll video them again, actually answering these questions. So thank everybody very much and look forward to the next webinar. There's one next month, so be prepared. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.